Okay, kids, let's get back into it. Let's take a look at working conditions. So the average working day was about 14 hours, sun up to sundown. So in the winter, you work less. Rain, snow, didn't matter what the work conditions are. And then you worked for about 6 days a week. You had Sundays off, but usually that was reserved for church. So you didn't really even get a weekend. Dirty, poorly lit factories. You're tired. Really dangerous, loud machinery. We're going to watch a video in class that'll sort of illustrate what just a few people went through during the Industrial Revolution. And then coal mining. Coal mining was probably one of the more dangerous jobs. Children coal mined as young as 4 years old, and they were stripped naked because their clothes would get caught. So you'd coal mine naked. Maybe you had underwear on, but that's about it. 4, 5, 6 years old. So here's some coal miners right here. These guys are called breaker boys because they, break in coal with a little pickaxe, and you got to drag it through on a sled. Here's some more breaker boys. This kid smiling over here is probably new. This kid over here, yeah, that's probably what you should look like. I think this kid's name's Turtle. And then, yeah, this kid probably was new. And then this isn't a poor quality photo. It is that dusty in there. So working in the coal mines, it's the equivalent of smoking about 5 to 6 packs of cigarettes a day. If you didn't die from a cave-in, you died from lung cancer or something like that. So you can see they're picking out sharp rocks. Well, that's what they were doing. So you got rocks in with the coals, so their job was to pick out the rocks and toss them aside and cut up their fingers. And they weren't allowed to wear gloves. I don't know, it's like especially cruel. So they made these like little finger extensions out of wood, and they'd use that kind of like chopsticks to pick up they tied off to their fingers to pick up the coal. And then you can kind of see these older kids with a beater stick. So if the kid like started slacking off, you'd whack them with a stick. Here's some more coal miners. This is a textile mill. They're putting thread on spindles, and his job was to eject the spindles. So every few yards, they had a kid who would sit there and like watch the spindles. You can see he's barefoot, and you see all that extra straight cotton down at the bottom. It'd be like breathing just cotton fibers all day. The inside of your lungs would look like a cotton candy machine. You'd suffocate, you'd cough up blood, jobs like these weren't sustainable. You were going to die from it. Some more coal miners, let's see. Newspaper boys. You can see them smoking. I mean, if you're old enough to have a full-time job, I guess you're old enough to smoke. I mean, nobody's going to really say anything about this, but a lot of kids were orphans, and they were, I don't want to say kidnapped, but given a job. And when you're a kid, I mean, you don't know any different. You could be abused and just never know. And yeah, there you are. Here's a depiction of a textile mill in Britain. These kids down here were called mill scavengers. They have to pick up all the loose cotton and take it back to the beginning so it can be turned into thread. And if your hair got sucked up, it was kind of like vacuumy up here because it's moving so fast. Your hair could get sucked up and it would scalp you and take your, chunks of your hair completely off and be bleeding everywhere. So here's an actual mill scavenger. She'd have to crawl under and do all this stuff. She's probably 5 or 6 years old. There's another picture, another mill scavenger, barefoot. This kid's barefoot, and there's not like little footholds. It's just pieces of pipe, and you stand there like all day, and you eject these rolls. They just roll up really fast, and then you pull them off and stick another roll on real quick. Here's child labor today. There's child labor still being used in different parts of the world. And then you guys are child labor. But it's not as bad as way back then. Here's some more jobs. See this kid working on a sewing machine. Looks like sewing pants together or something like that. Printing press. The printing press allowed for cheaper newspapers and things like that, and as a consequence, people were able to afford them, and everyone wants to know. See, they didn't have Instagram back then. If you wanted to read something, you read the newspaper. And if you really wanted to know, then you had to learn to read the newspaper. So literacy rates went way up after printing material became cheaper. Some more coal miners. He's not shocked. He just looked at the flash of the camera, and it, you know. Here's a depiction, just a realism painting of the countryside. So this would be all green right here, and all the coal dust has fallen, and it's made it all black. So we're going to watch a video, but obviously not during this video. So that's going to be in class. Another one. Class tensions. So you have different classes. So you have the working class. Laborers' lives had not improved. Working class, they can't really provide for their needs. This is how you define like poor people. They can't really provide for their needs, and wants are provided for every once in a while. Some laborers were replaced by machines. They were unskilled and replaced by machines. You have people called Luddites. They went in and damaged machines. Those were sabotagers. But Luddites, they didn't want machines because it replaced them. They're like, you don't need machines. Human labor is good enough. But the thing is, you really can't stop the progress of machines. I mean, they're coming for your jobs. And not only do we have machine muscle, we're starting to have machine brains or computers that can, do a job that human beings used to do, thinking jobs. Unemployment kind of became a serious problem, and the unemployed workers riot, and they lived in terrible conditions. And then you have a middle class. The middle class, basically all needs are met, and they can acquire some wants. And the middle class was looked down upon by the rich, like, how dare you? You're coming up thinking you're all business and all cool and stuff. Go back down and be poor. The rich didn't really like it. And the middle class had a pretty comfortable standard of living. And then your upper class, all needs are met, all wants are met. You don't even have to consider your needs. They're just provided for you. You have a butler who provides you food as a kid, and you just come to accept it. And yeah, again, the emerging middle class was looked down upon. Long-term benefits. So it creates jobs, encourages more technological progress. Education expands. You get cheaper products because people are making more money because they're higher skilled. The higher skilled you are, the more money you can make. That's why education is important. You at least need to do, at least today, 2 years of something at like DVC or something like that. Otherwise, you're on the road for welfare. Cheaper products. So if you make more products, the price goes down. Diet and housing improve, and then a reduction in child labor. Now, the reason why child labor reduced, not because children weren't necessary. Well, I'm sorry, opposite of that. Children became unnecessary in the workplace. It wasn't like, oh no, children are getting killed on the job. What do we do? It was machines are lifting heavier things that kids cannot possibly lift. Now, here's the thing. You can't, if you have a bunch of unemployed children, you can't just leave them be, and you can't have roving gangs of 5-year-olds cruising the streets. So what do? You put them in school. If you put them in school, they became higher skilled. And with these more skills, they took these higher skilled jobs, and then wages went up. And then when I say workers eventually win, what that means is they unionized. And we'll talk about that in a bit. They formed unions. They banded together and demanded things of their employer. And what they want are shorter hours and better wages, because if you work less, you're going to have to make more money to make up for what you're losing by working less. So if you work 14 hours a day and you're paid 50 cents, if you go to working 8 hours a day, you're losing out on, how much is that? 6 hours. Ooh, had to do math real quick. You're missing out on 6 hours worth of pay. So your wages have to go up like 75 cents or even $1. And then working conditions. Laborers were pretty much disposable because people kept having babies. And these babies would grow up and become workers, and the disposability of workers increase. Now, if you have skilled labor isn't as disposable. So it's a good idea to treat your workers well and not damage them because skilled workers are rarer. We're going to watch another video there. Impact of industrialization. Oh, that's out of whack. The rise of global inequality. So you start to see a wealth gap. During this time, you start to see colonization, where Britain stops looking at its own island for natural resources and begins eyeballing like Africa and China and India for resources. They can expand markets like tea. Where do you get your tea from? India. Where do you get other stuff from? You get rubber from Southeast Asia. You get gold from Africa. You get other stuff from Africa too. Congo, you get rubber. Belgium had Congo. We'll discuss all that later. You start to see imperialism. So if you go into someone else's fridge and take all of their food out and they have no way to replace their food, well, they've just become poorer. Transformation of society. So Europe and the United States gain economic power. African and Asian countries lag because we're taking all their stuff. We're exploiting their resources, and there you go. You have a rise in the middle class, and they call for more democratic reforms. They want, like some of these shorter days, they want that in law. They don't want to have to sit there and argue with their employer and have to put up with all the fighting in order to have a shorter workday. And then Germany unites as well, and they become one. And I put one as in quotes like that. We'll talk about it later, but the unification of Germany really did have a huge effect on all of Europe. Kind of led to World War I. So let's take a look at imperialism. Imperialism is where, like I said, Britain wasn't the only country. You had France, Belgium, other countries. They looked to Africa and China and India for resources. So you have wealth. So each country has wealth. But if Europe dips in and takes Africa's wealth, so like gold can't reproduce itself. Tea can kind of reproduce itself, but it takes a while. Rubber can kind of reproduce itself. But Europe was in those countries extracting the resources, making deals with leaders, and the leaders didn't care about the people because leaders were getting paid for what they were doing. So Europe in about 1815, this whole area in here becomes Germany. They unify just all these countries, take some chunks away from France, like right up in here, take some stuff away from Italy, right up in here. And then you have Austria and Germany. Austria loses power and Germany ends up taking some of Austria away. And then that takes us up to World War I. So philosophers of industrialization. So you have corporation. A corporation is basically, under the law, at least U.S. law, kind of like a person. It has freedom of speech, freedom of press. Now it kind of has freedom of religion. You have Hobby Lobby. The Supreme Court basically gave it freedom of religion to a certain extent. They have the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment protections. You can look that up on your own. 7th Amendment, 8th Amendment, 14th Amendment. So they have protections that a person can have. They're taxed, all that stuff. But a corporation is just a business. It's like a non-person person. So it has some rights. It can't vote. It can own property. The biggest thing is it can't vote, because if corporations can vote, we'd be in big trouble. So what a corporation is basically, let's say that you make t-shirts in your garage. So it's just you. You're what's called a sole proprietorship. You don't have to remember that, but it's just you. You're a small business, and you're making t-shirts, and your t-shirts take off. Like, everyone wants your t-shirts. You go sell them on the sidewalk, and you run out before the day's done, and people turn away like, oh, man. So you involve your friend, and your friend gets involved, and you produce 2x, 3 times as many t-shirts. And then you start making hats and pants and all that stuff. And still, there's a line out the door. So you got to keep upping your production. Now you reach a certain point where, wait, I can't afford to buy a warehouse and a bank won't give me a loan. So what do I do? So you form a corporation. And what a corporation is you are still the business, but you offer what's called stock. And stock is partial ownership in the company. So they pay you something like, so stock, let's say you have 1 million pieces of stock. So somebody buys, you sell your stock for $250 a piece. You offer 1 million, and everyone buys them at $250 a piece. Well, then you now have $250 million. You can buy that warehouse, you can buy employees, yada, 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 yada. You are now a corporation. And large corporations can what's called monopolize. Let's say that, you're a huge business now and you have your brand and all that stuff. And you start noticing another brand coming up through the ranks, and it's really popular with the people. And you have surplus profits, meaning like you're making profits and you have enough to spend however you want. So instead of competing against the person who's making this new brand and becoming popular and he's taking away your sales, you simply buy the brand. You buy his company. You give him $1 billion. You take his company, his brand, his idea, and you make it yours. And then basically you compete against yourself. It doesn't matter what people buy, you're getting the money. It's like if Levi's bought, I don't know, what clothing labels, Supreme, so if anybody buys Supreme, that, they're like, oh, I don't like Levi's, I like Supreme. It doesn't matter. It's still going to the Levi company because they bought Supreme. And then you get what's called laissez-faire economics. So you have a dude named Adam Smith, and he came up with the idea of, he kind of like wrote down all the rules of capitalism. And we talked about him earlier. Laissez-faire is a government that governs least in the economy, creates the best economy. So the best economy is when the government keeps its hands out of it. And then you have the invisible hand. What keeps people from cheating each other? There's this invisible hand that'll slap you. So like Yelp is kind of like an invisible hand where companies have an incentive to like not get a finger wag or a poor grade. They try to improve, but like Yelp's causing problems. Businesses are suing and all that stuff. So it's sometimes it gets a little muddy. And then specialization. If you break one big job down into smaller chunks, you end up doing better. Think about doing the dishes. Handle all the plates first, load the plates. Handle all the silverware, load all the silverware. Handle all the cups, load the cups. All the cookware, and then the stuff that can't go into the dishwasher, clean that up one at a time. Now, you leave them wet. You don't clean it and then dry it, clean it and then dry it. You clean it, stack it all up wet, and then pick up the towel, and it's just easier. It's just easier. You don't have to put as much thought into it, which can be tiring. That's why people don't like dishes. You see a mountain of dishes, you're like, oh. But if you just go after it and just do one dish at a time, just one dish at a time, it's not that big a deal. Actually, when you're an adult and you want to break, dishes are great. Dishes are great. For me, it's relaxing. But that's because I'm an adult and I have different responsibilities. But ask your parents. Dishes can sometimes be very relaxing. So here's how stock works. You have a great idea, but you don't have money to really fund your great idea. So you go to like an already rich person. So like, let's say Mark Cuban, that's his company. And you go there and you get either money from him, and then you become a corporation and you sell stock to investors. The investors give you money, and then you give them stock back, and everyone makes money. So the more profit you make, the more profit they make. So the thing about owning stock is it'd be nice if you owned a huge chunk of it. Usually you want to own at least 60% of it. That way you get to keep making the decisions for your company. Okay, you have a dude named Malthus, and M-A-L, I like to say that means bad. But basically what ended up in Europe is you have a finite amount of space. Finite meaning it's, small amount of space. Europe's only so big. So he saw population growing, but to feed this population, you need cows and wheat and stuff like that. But there's only so much room for cows and wheat. So at a certain point, the population is going to outstrip the food supply. There's going to be too many people to feed. So he said, the government should do nothing if a disease breaks out. The government should do nothing if people are starving. Let them starve. We need poor people. You need people who are starved to death because then everyone's going to run out of food. So he's like cool with like epidemics. Like if 5,000 people died of measles, that's sad, but whatever. It keeps the population down and all that stuff. Now, the thing is, though, is he didn't really think of how technology could improve the food supply. So years later, you have a dude named Fritz Haber, and he came up with a way to grow more food, basically. So you get more tomatoes per vine, more corn per stalk. And then years later, you have a guy named Norman Borlaug who came up with a way, because certain crops don't grow in certain areas because it's just the weather's too bad. He came up with a way to start genetically modifying different, like corn and wheat and stuff like that to grow in areas that it normally doesn't grow in. So now you can use areas of land that you normally wouldn't grow stuff in. So next on to Ricardo. Because of things that were happening, he sees what you call, carrying capacity is what Malthus was talking about. There's only so much room for food and people. And then you have Ricardo, who looked at capitalism and said, there's always going to be poor people. No matter what you do, there's always going to be poor people. Now, the thing is, though, is if you take a look at the United States' poor people, they're doing better than worldwide poor people. If you have a bed, have a closet with clothes in it, and a roof over your head, you're richer than, I think, 70% of the rest of the world. And most poor people have at least that. But the thing is, being poor is relative. You can still go to bed hungry, and there's still a lot more, wealth and food to go around. We waste 40% of all food that we have. So you'd think that, like, at least in the United States, we'd have enough to redistribute all that food, but we don't. So you'll go over, you'll go over this in class. Try doing this on your own when you take your notes. Socialism. So first off, you have utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is kind of a cold way of looking at how things work. Like Malthus would be a utilitarian, because he's like, death is good because it lowers the demand for food. Perfect. But if you take a look at anything from like a utilitarian standpoint, like what's the point of the speed limit being 65 if everybody goes 80? Well, if everyone's going 80, cops don't pull everyone over, because the whole point is to be safe. Now, those yellow signs that say at this curve go 45, if you go 80 around there, you're going to end up off the road. So it seems like warning signs have more utility than, legal signs or stuff like that, like a stop sign. Well, if it's 4 a.m. and you slow down, do you have to slow down at the line and go STOP and then move? It's just a way for everyone to, get their attention. But if it's 4 a.m. and there's no one else on the light, and you don't see headlights everywhere, can you roll through a stop sign? Or rolling through a red light. Usually takes about 3 seconds for someone to, from a red light when it turns green to start going. So can you run a red light? It's probably a good idea you don't. I hate people who do that, because it's like they go straight through and you're like, I'm ready to hit the accelerator. And then you see someone coming and you're like, dude, come on. So John Stuart Mill favors regulation to help workers because he sees that people having cash in their pocket has some utility because they go out and buy products. Kind of a smart move. So that's utilitarianism. Utopian. We're going to live in this utopia. Basically, everyone shares what they make, and there's no money. So if you're a baker, you just go about with a smile on your face baking bread, and people come in and take bread. But one thing about people is they're greedy. People will end up taking more than they need. So somebody will come in and say, the bread's free, and they'll take 5 when they only need 1. And then the 4 they have left over rot. So I mean, you have certain human behaviors that just don't work, but utopias try to get rid of that human behavior, and we don't have utopian communities anymore. They all failed because human beings are, have unlimited wants and unlimited needs. Socialism. Socialism is the idea that you have no individual owners of factories. You just the government takes them all over, and then the government would set prices and set wages and all of that stuff. So the economy would be totally run by the government, and that has been tried and it has failed because it just doesn't work. In economics, you'll learn why, but just know that it doesn't work. And then you have communism. Communism is radical socialism, and it involves some violence where you'll have, like the French Revolution, you had a bunch of people who were ticked off rise up and, kill all the rich people and the people above them. But the thing is, though, is after a while, they settled back into, normal capitalism. And previously, when we watch the video, I'll discuss conditions where socialism and communism kind of have to work. We already have, at least in the United States, some socialist things. Socialism, like when people talk about socialism, they think it's either all or nothing. You can kind of be socialist. You can have capitalism, but still pay taxes that provide for public roads and public schools and things like that. Because under normal circumstances, Domino's Pizza isn't going to be around to pave the entirety of the 680. So, I mean, yeah, you do need taxes to take care of stuff. But you also need capitalism. We use both. So the question is, how much socialism and how much capitalism do you need to balance society? So yeah, you guys can you'll be looking at this and doing that. You can do that in your notes if you missed it. And then labor unions. So I briefly touched on this. Unions, they negotiate three things unions want. They want better pay, better hours, better conditions, and then I always like to add Papa John's because it's a nice little way to remember it. Better pay, better hours, better conditions. So better pay and better hours, I already talked about that. Basically, if you lower your hours, you gotta increase pay. You want to increase pay anyways because you go to the average worker, and have you ever turned down a raise? No? Okay. And then they want better conditions. Now, the thing about better conditions is, do you want to die at work? No? All right. Put in a better catwalk. Put in a guard where the gears are. Don't work me 6 days a week. Things like that. I'm tired. I'd like what's called a weekend. We unions fought and won the weekend. So a strike. Strike is sort of a last-ditch effort to get your employer to do what you want. So basically, you band together, and some people, it's a small percentage, like 10% of the employees at a business will be the ones taking up the charge, and the other 90 will be too afraid of getting fired. So, they'll rally the other 90%, go outside and picket the place. They'll stop working. And when they stop working, it's kind of a battle. Can I survive? It's kind of like a standoff. The owner is losing money, but is he willing to lose that much money and negotiate higher wages? Or are the people going to break and go, oh man, and go back to work? So strikes, both sides lose, but the goal is to get labor winning. And strikes usually work on the side of labor, like BART. Anytime BART strikes, I mean, let's hope they struck for 3 days, and it screwed up the entire Bay Area commute. And they got what they wanted. I mean, that's as simple as that. I mean, if you don't have people running the trains, what are you going to do? And along with labor unions, Britain also passed laws, just to stop the worst abuses. Factories had to be cleaner and, better lit, and, couldn't, if you had to keep workplace injuries low. Mines stopped women and children from working underground, the Mines Act. Women didn't really work underground, but like I said about children, children kind of became useless Because when they're pickaxing rocks, it's like tiny little chunks. But if you can get a machine to do it, it's bigger rocks. A little 5-year-old can't pick up a giant rock. That's more for adults and stuff like that. So children became useless and kept. It was going to happen anyways. They really didn't need a law. And then a workday for women and children was reduced. And again, I mean, he needed more skilled labor. And, if a kid's working 10 hours a day, you can't put them in school to get that skilled labor. So again, it may have just worked out all by itself. And then the U.S. ends child labor, sets maximum hours in 1904. Didn't end all child labor. You guys aren't going to be able to do it. But when I was a kid, you had paper routes, but it was pretty corrupt. I'll talk about it more in class, but yeah, kids who did paper routes delivered newspapers. It was pretty exploitive. Britain abolished slavery, but Britain didn't need slaves anymore. With imperialism, you don't need slaves. Britain directly didn't need slaves. Britain would go to a leader of a country, and then that country would decide whether or not they needed slaves. So, yeah, Britain ended slavery, but they go to a country, make a deal, and then it was up to the dude in charge to depend on, how he wanted to run the country to get those resources Britain wanted. The U.S. ended slavery in 1865, which, if you go back to Adam Smith, he said that it's more efficient to not have slaves and just turn them into workers who earn a paycheck than it is to have slaves. The economy will make more money if you do that. And then women fight for rights. Women are starting to, they're working just as long as men, but they're getting paid less. They're doing dangerous jobs just like men, so they want to get paid more. I mean, it's just, fighting for women's rights. They want the right to vote. They want the right to own property, and, there's thousands of years of women never having that position, so or a position equal to men. So it took a huge cultural reorganization. It actually took 2 wars before it was proven that women could do the job of men, because men were over fighting and women took over the jobs that men had, like producing airplanes and tanks and stuff like that. And then reform spread. Free public schools. In Britain, I think they went up to 8th grade, and then later on high school, but high school wasn't until much, much later. And then prison reform. Usually prison in Britain was you just throw people away and forget about it, and they come out. But when they come out, the only thing they know how to do is commit crimes. So you started, you give them jobs like laundry and things like that. And, there were jobs in the economy where you just did laundry all day. So, I mean, they came out with some skills and some education, were taught to read and stuff like that to rejoin society and become a productive member. So we'll take a look at that. And we'll ignore that. And that pretty much ends it. So it ends on this slide right here. All right.